Hey guys, tonight, we drift into a midnight fog that hugs the surface of a vanished lake, where starlight shimmers in puddles like spilled silver. The air smells faintly of warm mud and crushed lilies, and the silence is so deep it feels like your ears are soaking in it. Somewhere nearby, a toad croaks once slowly. You're barefoot on a thin strip of soft, spongy earth, only it shouldn't exist. Beneath this unlikely path is nothing but water, and yet here you are standing on a floating garden that doesn't float at all. The year is somewhere between 1300 and 1500. You're in the Valley of Mexico on the surface of Lake Texcoco, well, sort of on the surface. The city of Tenochtitlan is still asleep behind you, a crown of flickering torchlight on its causeways and stepped pyramids. Ahead lies a strange agricultural miracle, the Chinampa, a system so clever, so deceptively simple, that even modern permaculture nerds look at it like, wait, they did what? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet press gently into the springy ground. It gives a little, not like a dock or raft, but like a living, breathing sponge. You look left, right ahead. Long, narrow plots stretch out, each one divided by gleaming channels of water. Willows and reeds rise from the edges like sentries, their roots tangled deep in watery anchorage. You can't quite believe it, but this entire quilt of green was built by hand, one muddy armful at a time. The Chinampas weren't rafts, as the name floating gardens might suggest. They were artificial islands built on the shallow beds of lakes, using a kind of aquatic Lego system. You pile up muck dredged from the lake bottom, layer it with rotting vegetation, mat it with reeds, and stake the corners with live trees, usually ahuejotes, a kind of water-loving willow. The result, a man-made patch of farmland that's self-irrigating, crazy fertile, and somehow sturdy enough for humans, dogs, ducks, and even the occasional bad-tempered llama. Historians still argue whether the first Chinampas date back to the Toltecs, or even earlier. But by the time the Mexica, what we call the Aztecs, rolled into the valley in the 14th century, the practice had been perfected into high art. They didn't invent the technique, but oh boy, did they max out the skill tree. Picture it from the air, thousands of green slivers poking out of the lake, like piano keys, their borders outlined by shimmering water. Crops line up in neat, almost military rows. Corn beans, squash, amaranth, tomatoes, foods you know and love, except they're growing in floating beds of muck in a lake that technically shouldn't support any farming at all. The whole setup looks like something from a video game strategy map, only nobody's playing. This is all real, and you're standing in the middle of it. A cool breeze lifts your hair as a heron flaps lazily overhead. Somewhere in the reeds, frogs plop into water, and then you hear it low and rhythmic, the swish of a paddle. A canoe slides out from a side canal, steered by a farmer wearing little more than a cotton loincloth and a head wrap. He nods at you, but doesn't stop. His boat is stacked with greens, squash blossoms, and what looks suspiciously like a giant lumpy cucumber. He's headed to the pre-dawn market, maybe even the great market of Tlatelolco, where tens of thousands gather each day in one of the largest trading hubs in the pre-modern world. No biggie. You crouch beside the water's edge, trailing your fingers in it. The liquid is surprisingly warm. That's because the shallow lake holds heat from the day like a giant solar blanket, gently incubating the Chinampas overnight. Microclimates. The Aztecs didn't have weather apps, but they knew how to hack nature better than most of us with smartphones and panic-inducing weather alerts. Now don't get too romantic. The lake isn't pristine. It's part fresh, part salty, and definitely part mosquito playground. You swat one off your arm, But even this annoyance had a use. Aztec farmers would harvest mosquito larvae protein-rich snacks and dry them into cakes. Yeah, bug granola. You probably won't survive this snack break. As you walk farther, the layout of the chinampas starts to make more sense. Long rectangular plots separated by canals just wide enough for a canoe, all anchored by vegetation and tree roots. It's modular, scalable, genius. And it wasn't just about growing food. The system allowed constant irrigation. As lake water gently seeped into the chinampas, plants got a slow, steady drink. And the canals weren't just for transport. They were thermal regulators, drainage buffers, and aquatic pantries full of edible greens, fish, and yes, more bugs. The crazy part: each chinampa could be harvested up to 7 times a year. Not once, not twice, 7. The soil was so rich, the moisture so balanced, that multiple crop cycles could run in the same space, while most medieval European farmers were praying their one crop of rye didn't get smacked by a late frost. You stop at the edge of a larger plot and stare at a group of workers. They're hunched low, silently weeding by hand under moonlight. No plows, no oxen, just people tools made of obsidian and wood and calloused fingers. You wonder how long they've been at it. Probably hours. Aztec society was rigid, and most people weren't priests or warriors. They were laborers, farmers, canal dredgers, backbone folks. The kind whose names don't survive in stone, but whose handiwork fed empires. One guy spots you and smiles. He's missing a few teeth. He gestures for you to try lifting a dredging basket. You grab the wooden handles and instantly regret your life choices. It weighs about as much as a baby hippo. Your biceps scream. He laughs, and then he points at a small pile nearby, dark, crumbly, stinking faintly of something familiar. It hits you. That's compost. But not just kitchen scraps. You squint closer. Yep, human waste, collected from the city's public toilets and mixed with organic debris to create nutrient-dense soil. The Aztecs may not have had indoor plumbing, but they absolutely knew how to recycle. Poop, the unsung hero of agriculture, but not everyone's convinced they loved it. Historians still argue whether the chinampa system was truly idyllic for farmers, or whether it masked deep inequities, land control, tribute quotas, even forced labor. Paradise comes at a price, after all. Still, as you lie down on the edge of a chinampa and gaze up at the stars mirrored in the canal water, it's hard not to feel awe. The land beneath you shouldn't be here. It was dreamed into being by muddy hands, stubborn minds, and people who figured out how to grow Eden in a swamp. You're still lying there on the soft, slightly squishy edge of a chinampa when you start to notice just how organized the world around you really is. This isn't a wild marsh with random patches of green. This is patterned, engineered, designed with such care it feels almost obsessive. You sit up, brush a few errant bugs off your tunic. Sorry, they're not going away, and look closer. Each chinampa measures roughly 30 meters long and 2 to 4 meters wide. That's not a coincidence. Those dimensions weren't about aesthetics, they were about function. That length allowed optimal space for planting rows of crops, and the narrow width ensured that no plant was ever too far from water. You might be tempted to call it ancient hydroponics, except this system doesn't need power cords, neon lights, or subscription boxes full of kale seeds. Just muck time and patience. And here's where things get really clever. You see a team of farmers not far from you working in tandem. One is dredging the canal, scooping out black lakebed silt using a long, curved basket. The others are laying this sludge across the surface of a chinampa in broad, even strokes, like frosting on a very earthy cake. This muck is called till-keel, and it's as nutrient-packed as an overpriced smoothie. Rich in decomposed plant matter and fish remains. It rejuvenates the soil with every layer. You can almost see the plants perking up as it's applied. Not kidding. Those chili sprouts just did a little shimmy. And if you're thinking, so what, they shoveled some mud on dirt, then buddy, you are not giving them nearly enough credit. The Aztecs figured out a sustainable soil cycle centuries before industrial farmers began worrying about topsoil erosion. While medieval Europe was exhausting its fields with repetitive wheat crops and awkward sheep-related decisions, these folks were turning lake gunk into black gold. Again and again, year after year. Historians still argue whether the system arose purely from ecological necessity, or whether it also served a spiritual function. The Aztecs were deeply cosmological people obsessed with balance, with the interplay between water and earth, sky and soil. Some scholars claim that building a chinampa was a ritual act, a way to harmonize with the lake's spirit. Others roll their eyes and say, nah, it was just practical. The truth, probably both. The Aztecs didn't exactly separate the sacred from the scientific. You wander toward a newly built chinampa. This one's raw, half-finished mud still drying on its edges. You crouch to inspect the base, a foundation of reeds and aquatic plants, layered thick, crisscrossed like a woven mat. That mat helps trap sediment, which builds up over time to form solid ground. Around the perimeter, long poles have been driven deep into the lakebed. Each pole supports a young ahuejote sapling, the water willow. These trees grow fast, sink deep roots, and over time knit the whole island together like nature's rebar. And get this, the trees weren't just anchors. Their leaves provided mulch. Their roots absorbed excess water. Their trunks could be pruned for firewood. They were like the Swiss Army knives of the ecosystem. You run your hand along one sapling. The bark is smooth, still young. It shivers gently in the breeze as if recognizing your admiration. Or maybe it's just cold. Who knows, you're not a willow whisperer. Nearby, someone shouts in Nahuatl. You turn to see two workers arguing over the angle of a canal wall. Turns out even mud farmers have opinions about geometry. The walls have to be just right angled, so they don't collapse porous enough to let water in, but solid enough to keep the crops from sloshing away during floods. It's not just a pile of dirt. It's instil architecture. The kind that holds up cucumbers. And if you think that's all they used, think again. The Aztecs used woven reed mats called petlatl as temporary walls. They'd sink them between poles, fill the space with muck, and let nature do the rest. The mats would decay over time, adding more nutrients to the mix. No waste. Just a rolling composting machine made from rope plants and pure hustle. You step back and notice something else, how modular the chinampas are. Add more muck, extend a wall, grow another bed. It's like ancient DLC packs. Expandable, upgradable, and scalable. That meant that as the population of Tenochtitlan exploded, farmers could just build more islands, need more food, add water and stir, and the yield insane. Some reports suggest that Chinampa agriculture could produce up to 7 tons of maize per hectare per year. 7 tons. That's enough tamales to feed your entire middle school, your enemies, and maybe your dentist's cat. It's no surprise, then, that Chinampas supported up to half of Tenochtitlan's food supply. Remember, this was a city of up to 200,000 people, more than most European capitals at the time, and it was floating on a lake. No pressure, right? Of course not. Everything was sunshine and squash blossoms. Chinampa building wasn't a one-time deal. It required constant upkeep. Canals had to be dredged regularly. Trees had to be pruned. Walls reinforced. If a storm hit or the lake level dropped, goodbye crops. Some farmers even rented chinampas or worked on them communally, and you can bet there were arguments. Hey, that's my mud pile. No, that's public silt. Well, then why does your corn keep creeping into my beans? You sigh, watching the workers take a quick break. One guy pulls out what looks like a tamal wrapped in green husk steams rising gently in the pre-dawn light. He breaks it open. Inside is quilitsum, wild greens harvested from the canals, nutrient-dense, delicious, and totally free. You're tempted to ask for a bite, but then remember you're technically a time-traveling ghost. Ghosts don't eat. Your stomach growls anyway. Rude. A muskrat splashes nearby, startling you. You laugh mostly at yourself. This place may be ancient, but it's also alive. Crawling with critters, buzzing with insects, quivering with chlorophyll. These aren't just gardens, they're ecosystems. Micro-habitats that support not only humans, but ducks, egrets, frogs, fish, and about 4 billion mosquitoes. Which fun fact also fed the fish that humans ate. Gross circle of life, maybe, but effective. As you wander back along the canal's edge, a gentle fog creeps in again. The air grows cooler. The smell of mud and greenery deepens. Somewhere nearby, a woman sings softly, probably to her crops. Sound carries weirdly here over water. It feels both close and far away. And just before you fade into that misty curtain again, you hear it, a splash, a paddle, a voice. More farmers arriving. More chinampas to tend. The work never stops. Not for the Aztecs. Not for the lake. And not for you either. You've only just begun to scratch the surface of this floating marvel. Trust me, the real magic, it's still ahead. The morning sun slips in with little fanfare, spilling its first golden fingers across the canals. You squint against the light, and the chinampas sparkle like nature dusted everything in lake glitter. And yet nobody seems to slow down. The farmers are already knee-deep in squash vines, checking for pests, plucking the ripest produce, chatting in Nahuatl between mouthfuls of roasted amaranth cakes. You trail behind a barefoot teenager balancing 2 baskets on a pole across his shoulders. One basket is packed with maize still in husk. The other filled with something that looks like salad and smells like pond. Spoiler alert, it's spirulina. Yes, the same trendy green goop that costs $14 a scoop in your gym smoothie was being farmed here in the 1400s now, scraped off the surface of brackish lakes and dried into cakes called tequitlatl. It wasn't just health food, it was legit fuel. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs considered spirulina a poor man's protein or a sacred supplement. Some sources suggest it was reserved for messengers, those wiry barefoot couriers, who jogged day and night across empire-wide relay systems. Others think it was just everyday grub. Either way, it's weirdly satisfying knowing that your overpriced superfood bar owes a debt to swamp gunk and sun. But chinampas weren't just about greens and grains. Let's talk layout. You notice how the gardens seem to form a living grid, orderly, linear, controlled. The canals that snake between them aren't random either. They're cut in right angles, with a boxund north-south orientation, where possible. Why? To maximize sunlight, of course. That's farming 101, and the Aztecs were acing the class centuries before colonists even brought over steel plows. But also, maybe there was something deeper. Some archaeologists believed the orientation had cosmological meaning. The Aztecs didn't separate farming from spirituality. North, south, east, west, these directions weren't just GPS points. They were sacred pathways connected to gods and elemental forces. Growing maize in straight lines facing east that could have been a farming technique, or a prayer. You turn to follow another canal, this one slightly wider, almost like a garden boulevard. Canoes glide through it like quiet sea creatures. And this time, instead of farmers, you spot city officials in long tunics and headbands. One's making notes on a bark paper scroll, muttering to himself. Yes, syntaxes. That's right. These chinampas weren't just backyard projects. Most of them were recorded, mapped, and taxed. Nobles and the priestly class owned large swaths of them. Commoners farmed them. Tributes were paid in maize beans, chilies, or flowers, especially flowers. You wouldn't believe how many chinampas were dedicated entirely to growing blooms for rituals, markets, and yes, even public image. You overhear one official arguing with a farmer about quotas. He gestures to a bunch of underwhelming-looking chili plants, saying something that sounds very much like, "This won't do." The farmer protests. It's been a rough season, too much water, maybe a fungal blight. The official sighs and scribbles something that can't possibly be a 5-star review. And here's where it gets complicated. See, chinampas seem like this perfect symbiosis of humans and nature, and in a lot of ways they were. But like any successful system, they became politicized. Ownership was hereditary or tied to noble clans. Tributes weren't optional. Miss a quota, the consequences weren't just passive-aggressive side-eye. You might be forced to work extra days dredging canal sludge under a hot sun, or even lose access to your plot entirely. Some chinampas were also communal, managed by Kalpulli kinship-based neighborhood units. They shared resources and rotated labor. That sounds cozy until you realize that meant shared accountability. If your cousin's corn flopped, everyone took the heat. Thanksgiving dinner must have been tense. Historians still argue whether chinampas empowered small farmers or enslaved them under tribute-heavy expectations. Was this eco-utopia or soft tyranny with extra beans? There's no easy answer. But either way, one thing is clear: chinampas required cooperation. A collapsed canal didn't just mess up your cucumbers, it affected your neighbor's water flow, your cousin's fish trap, the tax collector's spreadsheet. Everything was connected. Speaking of water, let's detour into hydrology. The Aztecs didn't just rely on nature to do its thing. They engineered the lake. Let that sink in. They engineered a lake. Dams, dikes, sluices, aqueducts. All to control salinity, water level, and flooding. Lake Texcoco was a brackish mescoction part, freshwater part, salt. The southern half was more usable, especially around Xochimilco, where many chinampas thrived. But the northern half, Salt City. So in true Aztec style, they built a massive dike system. The Albaradon of Nezahualcoyotl, a 16-kilometer-long barrier to keep fresh water in and salty water out. It worked surprisingly well when maintained. Maintenance, however, was a whole other thing. You needed manpower, materials, coordination. All of which, by the way, could be disrupted by drought floods, war, or Spanish conquistadors stomping through with horses and smallpox. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You sit beside the canal, now watching a group of kids splash around, while their elders load produce into reed baskets. A woman braids flowers into a garland. Another sorts chilies by color. There's music drifting in from the city drums, flutes, distant singing. It's a marketplace day. You follow the group toward the city edge where the chinampas start blending into the causeways and stone infrastructure of Tenochtitlan itself. This was never just farm country, it was part of a living urban food system. Produce from chinampas flowed daily into the city, feeding everyone from street vendors to palace cooks. Boats moved everything. No wheelbarrows, no carts, just canoes gliding across water highways like grocery store lanes with better scenery. You spot a man selling fresh tortillas from a floating stall. His griddle sits on a clay oven balanced on a canoe deck. Steam rises, mingling with the scent of lime-treated maize. You take a deep breath. Forget spirulina. This is heaven. As you drift with the morning tide, one final thought lingers: this system, this lake world, wasn't a fluke. It was intentional. Refined over generations. Not just functional, but elegant. And if the Aztecs could design an ecosystem that fed hundreds of thousands with no fossil fuels, no pesticides, no plastic bags, then maybe, just maybe, we've got something to learn. By now the sun has fully risen, filtering soft gold across the lake, like someone turned up the warm filter on the entire world. You drift past the chinampas as they bask in it, their green rose glowing, dew still glinting on amaranth leaves and squash blossoms. The scene would feel almost too perfect, like a still from a nature documentary, if it weren't for the snorting pigs on a nearby raft. Yes, pigs on a raft. That's your cue to talk about livestock. Because believe it or not, the Aztecs didn't just cultivate plants out here. While they didn't have cows, goats, or chickens, those would all arrive rudely with the Spaniards. They had their own floating animal husbandry. Dogs, turkeys, ducks, and the occasional pig-like creature, not pigs, but peccaries. Wild and scrappy, were raised near chinampas or on floating pens. And then there's the xoloitzcuintli, the hairless, slightly creepy, definitely noble Aztec dog, kept for warmth, protection, and yes, sometimes for protein. Don't look at me like that. You eat chicken nuggets. They had xolos. You float a little closer to the raft and see two boys tossing food scraps to a pair of wide-eyed turkeys whose gobbles echo weirdly across the water. Around the raft, a fenced floating ring keeps the birds from flying off, and dried milpudge stalks form the coop walls. Efficient, yes. Sanitary. Well-defined sanitary. But here's the real kicker. Even the animal waste was used. Farmers collected it, dried it, and added it to the rich lakebed silt for fertilizer. That's right. They invented a closed-loop system before it was cool. Nothing wasted. Chickens fed people. Chickens fertilized plants. Plants fed people. Plants fed chickens. Full circle. Zero waste. You're living in a compost dream. Historians still argue whether animal pens were common across all chinampa zones, or mostly clustered around elite plots near the city's edge. But either way, livestock wasn't some sideshow, it was part of the whole brilliant, messy ecosystem. As you float on your canoe, passes under a low bridge, just a few planks stretched over two banks. On the other side, something changes. The rows are tighter here, more structured. You've entered a nursery zones. You spot raised reed trays covered in seedlings, tiny maize shoots, bean sprouts, and tomato plants just barely emerging from moist soil. These were seed starting stations, designed to protect the most delicate young crops from heavy rains or pests until they were strong enough to transplant. The trays are elevated on willow branches, and underneath you can see the slow crawl of water beetles. Everything here is alive, layered, and purposeful. A woman stands nearby, her arms dusted in black silt, gently coaxing a sprout out of the tray with her fingers. She cradles it like it's made of crystal before moving it to a pre-dug hole on a nearby chinampa. You notice she's planting in triads, maize beans, and squash together. The three sisters. The holy trinity of Mesoamerican agriculture. Maize grows tall, acting as a living trellis. Beans climb the stalks, enriching the soil with nitrogen. Squash sprawls at the base, blocking weeds and locking in moisture. It's cooperative planting, nature's group project, but one that doesn't end in passive-aggressive emails. You try to imagine a modern farm that planted like this. Can you picture a factory field where corn and beans hug it out while squash acts like a leafy babysitter? it'd be chaos. Or maybe genius. Nearby, you spot a man walking slowly with a bundle of flowering plants. Not food, but chachwea o medicinal herbs. He's headed toward a small chinampa that looks more like a spa than a farm. Lavender, marigold, epazote, and even cacao saplings, if you're not mistaken. This one's special, probably owned by a healer or apothecary. The Aztecs believed deeply in thyme plant medicine. And the chinampas weren't just about calories, they were a living pharmacy. Some fringe scholars argue that certain chinampas were ritual gardens. Spaces meant for specific ceremonies or offerings, perhaps planted with cycles of the moon or aligned with sacred dates in the Aztec calendar. Whether that's poetic fantasy or legit anthropology, we may never know. But the vibe here definitely a little mystical. You lean closer and catch the scent of chukata, chempasuchil, the marigold used in offerings to the dead. The flowers blaze orange and gold under the morning sun, petals clustered like sleepy flames. Their strong aroma wards off pests and, according to tradition, guides spirits home. Farming with function and soul. That's the chinampa way. A dragonfly zips past your ear, hovers, then darts away. You flinch gracefully, you hope, and then remember that dragonflies are mosquito assassins. So yes, let them buzz. Chinampas were buggy, but nature balanced things out. Fish ate larvae, birds ate bugs. Dragonflies kept the mosquito party under control. No pesticides. Just food chains with flair. You begin to notice just how many insects are actually here, not in a gross way, but a balanced way. You pass a beehive hung from a willow bees darting in and out of the carved gourd casing. That's Melipona beechai. A stingless native bee species. The Aztecs didn't just farm honey, they farmed flavored humtectins. Honey. Nectar from different flowers produced distinct tastes prized for both eating and healing. Imagine that boutique honey centuries before hipsters branded it. You pause at a small table set up by a canal. A woman is blending honey chili and crushed cacao beans into a paste. Not quite hot chocolate, not quite mole. She offers some on a reed spoon. You reach for it instinctively before remembering ghost rules. No touching, no tasting. Just eternal hunger. Sorry. Still, the scene feels almost modern. Vertical planting, rotating crops, integrated pest management, soil regeneration, polyculture, local food systems, low emissions, community farming. You begin to wonder if this entire floating garden was less of a prehistoric curiosity and more like a blueprint we forgot to keep following. Even the layout of each plot reflected deep thinking. Crops planted at different heights for water access. Paths designed to minimize trampling. Shade trees positioned to prevent evaporation. Some chinampas were even deliberately flooded to rest. The soil a kind of Aztec crop sabbatical. Meanwhile, ducks moved and fertilized everything, ate pests, and got fat. Win-win. So here you are, floating past systems so smart they feel like science fiction, and yet they were real. Are real. Parts of Xochimilco's Chinampa system still exist today, barely clinging to survival amid urban sprawl and pollution. Modern agronomists study them. Activists protect them. Farmers still plant those rows by hand, just like their ancestors. You begin to drift again, the boat rocking gently beneath you. There's a rhythmic splash from a distant paddle. The sun warms your face. You close your eyes. You've just scratched the surface of this ancient miracle, but already you can feel the genius of it in the mud beneath your feet, The pollen in the air, the quiet whisper of a system built not to conquer nature, but to collaborate once with it. Your boat rocks ever so slightly as a canoe loaded with bright red chilies glides past, sending tiny ripples across the mirrored surface of the canal. You adjust your balance, lean a bit on your elbow, and watch the reflection of the willows sway like dancers on water. But soon your eyes catch something less poetic: figures on the bank moving rhythmically with long poles. Dredgers. These people aren't harvesting food. They're harvesting mud almond. Specifically, the sticky, nutrient-rich black silt from the bottom of the canals. You wrinkle your nose as one man lifts a basket of it toward the surface. It sloshes like pudding and smells like something your plumber would scream about. But this stinky lake gunk, it's the secret sauce of the Chinampa system. This practice, called lodo dredging, is one of the cleverest examples of how the Aztecs kept their floating farms fertile year after year. No chemical fertilizer, no rotating between corn and regret. Just lake bottom to garden bed endlessly. This muck was rich in organic matter from decomposing plants, fish droppings, even runoff from upstream forest zones. Every few weeks they'd scoop it, dry it slightly, and layer it between crops like frosting on a cake. Some farmers even built a calendar of dredging, keeping careful track of when each plot had its last silt feeding. Miss a cycle and your beans came out puny. Stick to the rhythm and your squash leaves would get so big they could double as beach umbrellas. Historians still argue whether this dredging system was fully self-sustaining or whether it masked deeper environmental wear. Some say it was a perfect loop. Others point to sediment buildup, canal choking, and lake shrinkage over time. No system is flawless forever, but the fact that this one ran smoothly for centuries, that's still a mic drop moment for ancient engineering. But here's the cooler part. That same muck served more than just roots. It became insulation during cold snap, sealant for cracked canoes, and when mixed with straw, even a crude plaster for temporary field shelters. You're starting to get the picture. This wasn't just agriculture. It was agricultural alchemy. Nearby, a woman dips her hand into the water and lifts a squirming handful of axolotls. Those cute, permanently smiling salamanders that look like Pokémon, but are real edible and tragically endangered. The Aztecs adored them, not just as pets, but as food medicine and spiritual symbols. Their name means water monster or water twin, possibly linked to the god Xolotl, brother of Quetzalcoatl, who was said to have transformed into one to avoid sacrifice. Very relatable. The axolotl was believed to carry regenerative powers. Scientists today are still baffled by their ability to regrow limbs, hearts, even parts of their brain. You break a toe and limp for 6 weeks. These guys drop an arm and regrow it like it's no big deal. You watch as a few of them dart back into deeper water, little gill frills swaying behind them. There's a strange peace in it. This isn't farming the way you're used to. It's a symphony. And each player, from the ducks to the dredgers, knows their part. You continue floating past another Chinampa, where the crops have been arranged with almost suspicious perfection. Each plant precisely spaced, each corner tidy. This is no ordinary garden. It's a model plot, managed by temple stewards or elite farmer priests. These demo gardens were partly for function, partly for flex. Schools of agriculture, yes, they existed, brought students here to learn proper planting techniques. Imagine Hogwarts, but instead of wands, they're waving maize stalks. Some fringe theories suggest these elite plots were also part of ritual performance. where planting and harvesting were done on sacred dates under the observation of priests. The act of sowing was more than just food prep. It was a reenactment of the gods' creation of life. To plant was to pray with your hands. Near the edge of the demo plot, you spot stone markers, etched glyphs barely visible through the moss. These weren't decorative. They marked boundaries sometimes, ownership, sometimes even seasonal alignments. The Aztecs didn't use private deeds like we do, but they knew exactly who owned what. Land disputes were handled in courts with evidence often drawn from communal memory, not paper. That said, cheating existed. Of course it did. Some families tried to expand their plots illegally. One method: sneaky shoveling. Digging into the lake floor and extending your chinampa by a few feet each year. It's the real estate version of a slow creep. You imagine some poor canal patrol guy being like, "Wasn't this plot smaller last spring?" and getting gaslit into silence. You pass a man reclining on the bank playing a bone flute. His notes drift over the water, eerie and sweet, echoing off willow trunks. Music wasn't just a vibe, it was woven into daily life. Farming, cooking, praying, even weeding had rhythms. Drums paced labor. Songs marked the seasons. At festivals, entire floats of flowers and food were set adrift across the canals as offerings. Picture water parades, petals drifting in concentric rings as incense burned from canoe altars. Chinampas weren't just farms, they were hung stages for divine theater. And on those rare days when all work paused, the community gathered at the water's edge, sharing tamales, chocolate drinks, and fried amaranth balls, while laughing under paper banners strung between trees. The festivals honored gods like Tlaloc, the rain guy Chicomicoatl, goddess of agriculture, and of course Sleep-Totec, lord of rebirth and freshly peeled corn. You're beginning to feel it now, the hum of it all. The lake isn't just alive, it's consentient, in its own way. Every part of it speaks, breathes, remembers. A floating archive of choices and miracles. As your boat circles back toward the hub of activity, you realize something remarkable. These farms weren't just feeding mouths. They were feeding minds, spirits, traditions, innovations, and entire social orders. A chinampa wasn't just a plot. It was an ecosystem, a school, a stage, and a sanctuary. And even though your ghost body never gets hungry, you still feel your stomach flutter as you pass another canoe laden with tlacoyos. Thick masa cakes stuffed with beans and squash blossoms still warm and steaming in the morning sun. You're floating through a feast built not in decades, but centuries. And somehow it still feeds us even when we don't see it. You push gently away from the banks, your boat gliding once more into deeper water. It's quieter now. The crowds of morning activity have thinned, and you find yourself surrounded by long corridors of green like lanes through a living labyrinth. Birds flit overhead, white egrets, black coots, something you can't name with a curved beak and loud opinions. But you don't mind the company. Off to your left, a boy is balancing precariously at the edge of a chinampa, dragging a narrow net through the canal water. It's not for fish, although tilapia and carp have invaded these waters in recent centuries. No, this net is for the aquatic vegetation. The Aztecs called it tolachin, lakeweeds, algae duckweed. All the slimy, gunky stuff you might normally side-eye and call a health hazard. To them, it was future compost. Farmers gathered it by the boatload, dried it in the sun, and mixed it into their soil beds. Like the lodo dredged from the lake bed, this green muck became part of the nutrient cycle. Slimy, yes. Smart, even more. Historians still argue whether this constant harvesting of lake plants impacted the aquatic ecosystem long-term, or helped preserve balance. Either way, the system kept water pathways open and fertilized chinampas for generations, without synthetic inputs or fossil fuels. Eat your heart out industrial agriculture. You glance down and spot lily pads drifting under your boat. A frog sits on one totally unbothered, and then a flash of silver, and a wattle swarm. You blink, not sure you saw it right, but yes, tiny insect eggs glistening like miniature pearls clinging to floating reeds. Ahuatl, also called Mexican caviar. These were the eggs of aquatic insects, mostly water boatmen. Coryxidae, that laid their eggs on submerged stalks. Aztecs harvested them with handmade screens, sun-dried them, and turned them into tamale fillings or fluffy cakes with chili and epazote. Apparently they tasted like fishy popcorn. You're skeptical. But hey, when in Tenochtitlan, these edible insects weren't fringe snacks, they were mainstream proteins. So while your ancestors were munching bland barley gruel, Aztec kids were sitting by the canal popping crunchy bug eggs like it was movie night. Culture, my friend. Up ahead, another canoe is gliding toward you, this one piled with tall stalks of tulle, a type of bulrush that grows abundantly along the lake's edge. You hear the soft scraping of blades as men in the boat harvest them from the shallows, slicing the long reeds at their base. Tulle wasn't food, it was infrastructure. The Aztecs used it for matting insulation boats and even roofing. In fact, the very seat beneath you might be padded with woven tulle mats. It's surprisingly soft, durable, naturally waterproof. You wonder why your furniture isn't made from it. Then you realize you're surrounded not just by farming, but by hum materials. The chinampa system wasn't only about growing what you eat. It was about building what you needed. A floating supply chain, from the fiber of amaranth stalks used for weaving baskets to sunflower oil. Pressed from tiny seeds to dyes made from crushed marigolds, this aquatic world was a living hardware store. And all of it sustainable, seasonal, and homegrown. You want a robe grow cotton? Need soap harvest yucca root? Want to paint the gods ferment cochineal bugs? It's DIY taken to a whole other level. You pass a small chinampa overrun with wildflowers. Their purple and yellow blooms humming with bees. A young girl is picking them by hand, placing them carefully into a reed basket. These are not accidental. Wildflower plots were planted intentionally, partly to attract pollinators, partly for ritual purposes. And partly because, let's be honest, they made the place look stunning. A fringe theory suggests certain flower species were used to tune the energy of each chinampa like crop-based feng shui. No hard proof, but it makes a weird kind of sense when you're here. Some plots feel serene, others electric, could just be wind patterns, could be hapikotum same, flower magic. Who are we to say? The girl waves, then darts off behind a wall of maize. You follow her with your eyes and notice a grove of trees rising at the chinampa's edge. Ahuejotes. You've seen them before, but now you see them differently. These fast-growing willows weren't just decoration. They were your anchors. Their roots digging deep into the mud and keeping each chinampa from drifting. Think about that. These farms float, but they don't drift. They're alive but contained. The ahuejote is what makes that possible. It's like the loyal friend who shows up early and never needs recognition. And beyond anchoring its leaves fed animals, its branches became fencing, and its canopy offered shade during scorchingly hot months. One tree, a dozen roles. Aztec multitasking at its finest. Suddenly, a wind kicks up carrying the scent of wood smoke from the far side of the lake. Your ghost nose twitches. You follow the trail to a cooking raft, a flat chinampa outfitted like an open-air kitchen. A group of women laughing and gossiping are grilling quilites over hot stones. These leafy greens, often called weeds today, were prized for their flavor and nutrition. You spot varieties like huzontle, verdolaga, and romerito, each with a distinct flavor profile. Bitter, tart, earthy. These weren't desperation foods, they were delicacies. Served with amaranth tortillas, fried insects, or mole, they formed the leafy soul of the Aztec diet. One woman spoons a bright green sauce into a bowl and sets it down beside a thick tamal wrapped in corn husks. The sauce sizzles with roasted tomatillo and ground pumpkin seeds. You hover closer, dreaming of taste you'll never feel. Sorry, ghost rules still apply. In that moment, surrounded by sizzling stones and smoke and simmering sauce, you realize that the chinampas weren't just farms. They were taptim, flavor engines. Every texture, every smell, every heat level was sourced from just a few paddles' distance. Farm to table wasn't a trend, it was Tuesday. A child claps as someone flips a tamal too high, and it splashes into the canal with a plop. Laughter erupts. Even the ducks seem amused. The wind dies down. Your boat drifts again, passing one last chinampa, this one filled with seed keepers. Elder farmers bent with time are sorting maize kernels into rows, red, white, blue, yellow, even black. These weren't just pretty colors. Each maize variety had a purpose, for grinding, boiling, fermenting, planting, praying. Seed saving was sacred. A ceremony, not a chore. The entire future of chinampa farming depended on remembering which seed came from which plant, which canal, which harvest moon. Lose that, and you lose more than a crop, you lose a story. One elder lifts a deep blue kernel to the light and murmurs something. Maybe a blessing, maybe a joke, maybe both. And just like that, you understand. This floating world is not made of soil and wood and silt alone. It's made of duchma, memory, alive in every seed, every splash, every bite of bug-egg tamal. You lean back, letting your boat glide lazily through the canal, its bottom brushing gently against suspended root networks and tufts of floating water plants. Somewhere nearby, a heron lifts off in slow motion, wings wide as a dinner table. You exhale, though technically, as a dream tourist, you don't need to breathe. Still, the air tastes of damp soil, crushed herbs, and wood smoke. Not bad for an ancient metropolis. A low murmur catches your attention, drawing you toward a cluster of chinampas arranged like puzzle pieces. You're approaching a market zone. Not the grand marketplaces like Tlatelolco, but the neighborhood-level trading spaces often held right here on the water. Carts, nope, just canoes, dozens of them docked around a central platform bobbing gently like toddlers in a wading pool. This is a barter bonanza. Everyone's got something, and no one's using Venmo. You pass a canoe stacked with cacao beans, Aztec money more or less next to another, piled with hand-woven baskets and obsidian scrapers. But what makes your jaw drop, or would, if you had one right now, is the sheer variety of vegetables. Over there, avocados still warm from the sun. To your right, fat squashes stacked like prehistoric bowling balls. And just beside them, a tray of bright red chiltepin peppers, which could probably melt steel. One older woman is counting out cured fish wrapped in maguey leaves. Another is haggling over 3 ears of purple corn in exchange for a jar of pulque. The fermented agave drink that tastes like kombucha had a midlife crisis. Deals are struck with quick nods, a few dramatic sighs, and lots of side-eye. It's delicious. Historians still argue whether these mini-markets were truly decentralized or secretly controlled by local officials. Some records hint at tax-like quotas enforced by tribute collectors. Others suggest farmers had more freedom than you'd expect under imperial rule. The truth, probably somewhere in the middle as usual. You catch sight of a boy with a bundle of xocolotl pods, the bitter cacao seeds used to make the frothy chocolate drink so beloved. It was reserved for the elite and warriors. And yeah, it wasn't sweet. No marshmallows, no milk, just roasted cacao ground with chili, sometimes flavored with flower petals or maize gruel. A power smoothie that could probably punch you awake from a coma. Nearby, a group of teens in reed hats pass around a gourd bowl of it, pretending not to notice each other blush. Ah, yes. Nothing like bitter hot chocolate to help you flirt and feel alive. A woman with silver in her hair is offering a smaller, more intriguing item, a bag of amaranth seeds, mixed with honey and shaped into small figurines. This is tzoali, the Aztec version of a granola bar crossed with religious iconography. These weren't just snacks. They were edible effigies, offered during sacred festivals and then eaten ceremonially, sometimes representing communion with gods. Fringe theories even say some believed you were consuming a piece of the divine itself. Aztec transubstantiation, if you will. Of course, these practices irritated the Spanish something fierce when they showed up, and many were banned as idolatry. Which is funny considering they were fine munching on communion wafers shaped like deities back home. You drift past a docked canoe where two sisters are arranging their produce in color-coded pyramids. Their chilacayote, a spiky green squash the size of a toddler, sits proudly in the center. It's prized for candy making and medicinal tea. They dust it with ash to preserve it, a trick passed down from the ancients. Just behind them, a wiry man hauls a huge basket of nopal cactus pads, freshly sliced and oozing clear slime. Slimy, yes, but nutritious, absolutely. The pads are grilled, diced, juiced, and even turned into soap and shampoo. And don't get us started on the prickly pear fruits, sweet enough to convert even the pickiest child. Somewhere out there, an Aztec mom is handing one to a grumpy kid with a "you'll eat it and like it" look. A little girl tugs on her mother's sleeve, pointing at a canoe where a merchant is selling turkeys. Not frozen, not plucked, just angry, loud, flapping, and very much alive. Turkeys were one of the few domesticated animals in the region prized not just for meat, but feathers used in fans' cloaks and festival headdresses. And trust us, if you've never heard an Aztec turkey scream, you haven't lived. Some scholars say turkey feathers were a status symbol, especially when dyed with cochineal reds or indigo blues. Others argue they were just practical, lightweight, colorful, and abundant. Either way, fashion in Tenochtitlan wasn't just stones and shells. It was yucca feathers with flair. As the sun climbs higher, the market bustles louder. Someone's playing a clay flute shaped like a jaguar, its growling tone weaving through the crowd. You float past a teenage boy balancing on a canoe's edge, juggling 3 tiny chapulines. Yes, grasshoppers. Not for show, for sale. Protein-packed, fried, and seasoned with lime and chili, they're one of the tastiest snacks in the empire. Crunchy, salty, a little spicy, like if popcorn had 6 legs and attitude. Fringe idea. Some anthropologists believe chapulines might have been used in schoolboy dares. Eat it whole, they'd say, or she won't talk to you. Peer pressure even then. Another boat sells algae cakes. Yes, little patties made from sun-dried spirulina. The Aztecs harvested it from the lake surface with woven nets and considered it a sacred superfood. Modern nutritionists agree high in protein, vitamins, and possibly your daily dose of lake weirdness. You glance around, realizing how much of this market revolves around the Chinampa network. Not just the produce, but the herbs, animals, even the fuels. Canoe access meant rapid delivery. Small-scale trading kept families fed. And the goods, seasonal, local, zero waste. Basically, your organic grocery store fantasy minus the checkout line and with more bug eggs. One man sells obsidian blades next to a pile of dried chilies. Another offers blown glass beads, bartered in from coastal traders stacked beside smoked frog legs and tamarind pods. You can almost hear Whole Foods executives crying softly in the distance. A quick gust of wind ruffles the reed mat banners strung between boats. A tiny child clutches her father's leg as a paper kite made of maize husk rises into the air. You watch it dance, spiraling above the floating market, casting a flickering shadow across the water. And as the sun begins its slow dip, vendors start packing up. Nothing is wasted. Unsold food returns to the home plot, uneaten scraps go to ducks or compost piles. Even the wooden paddles are rinsed and placed with care, because here every piece of this ecosystem is precious. Nothing extra, nothing lost. And as you float away from the Chinampa market, leaving behind the hum of commerce and corn-scented air, you begin to grasp just how intimately connected this system was. Not just economically, but spiritually, physically, even ecologically. The marketplace wasn't separate from the farms, it was their heartbeat. So the sun is slipping west now, casting long shadows across the water. The Chinampas take on new shapes. Tall maize stalks stretch like golden antennae, and every ahuejote tree seems to lean just a little closer to the water's surface. You coast in slow silence, your boat gently nudging against a submerged log that may or may not be alive. You're not investigating. Up ahead, a narrow canal opens into a wider bay, its glassy surface disturbed only by the V-shaped ripples of paddling canoes and the occasional splash of something amphibious. It's here you begin to notice that this floating world, for all its agriculture and trade, wasn't just about survival. No, this place was engineered for something else too: balance. You're entering the realm of ecological sophistication, my friend. The kind of balance that modern cities only dream about if they even remember how to dream. Let's talk soil fertility. Because yes, even in a ghost tour, we make room for dirt science. Chinampa farmers didn't rely on the soil staying magically fertile year after year. That would be rookie behavior. Instead, they built a loop, a circular dance between lake and land. Every few seasons, they'd dredge muck from the bottom of the canals, the same oozy, mineral-rich sludge you nearly fell into earlier, and spread it across the Chinampa surface. This added nutrients kept the soil fluffy and basically recharged the land. Kind of like composting, but wetter and with more leeches. This process was called tichatl, and while it sounds like a sneeze, it was vital. Some researchers argue the dredging also kept canals navigable and controlled mosquito larvae. Others aren't so sure. It's an ongoing debate. But whether by design or accident, the practice kept the whole floating web thriving. And speaking of web, we need to talk about the axoxlonesome. Yes, the smiling, squishy-faced amphibian that looks like a Pokemon you can pet. Native to the lakes of the Valley of Mexico, especially Lake Xochimilco, axolotls thrived in the cool, clear canal waters of Chinampa zones. They're cogneogenic, meaning they retain their juvenile features into adulthood, gills, smile, overall cuteness. But don't be fooled. The Aztecs saw them as sacred shape-shifting spirits. According to myth, They were the transformed form of Xolotl, god of monsters and misfits. That's right, even the gods didn't want to grow up sometimes. Axolotls were harvested occasionally for food or medicine, but more often they were observed with reverence. Modern scientists now study them for their regenerative abilities. They can regrow limbs, spinal tissue, even parts of their brains. Fringe theory. Some scholars believe ancient herbalists attempted to replicate axolotl regeneration in human healing rituals. Salves, chants, maybe even edible concoctions. Whether it worked is unclear. But the faith in it, very real. You drift past a cluster of water lilies, their blossoms bobbing like lazy dancers. Beneath them, an entire microscopic universe. Insects, algae, microorganisms, all part of the nutrient flow. The Aztecs understood this not through microscopes, but through generational observation. You can almost hear a grandfather telling a wide-eyed child, "See where the duckweed grows thickest. That's where the water is warmest and safest to plant chilies nearby." Science through storytelling. That's how they passed it on. You spot a small hut nestled at the corner of a chinampa, barely visible behind the maze. A farmer steps out, stretching face lit by the golden hour glow. He heads toward the canal with a woven basket he's going to release. Ducklings. Yes, ducks. Not just for meat or eggs, but for pest control. They waddled across the chinampas, munching on larvae snails and beetles that would otherwise nibble precious leaves. Their droppings natural fertilizer, their presence a living insecticide. You think modern permaculture is clever, the Aztecs had it baked into their daily routine. Historians still argue whether this integrated approach was systematized policy or just brilliant improvisation. Either way, it worked. The floating farms didn't just sustain themselves, they invited nature in. They collaborated with it. You glide past a chinampa, where 3 kids are playing beside a shallow duck pond, laughing as the birds chase them in slow, hissing waddles. One of the kids tosses something shiny into the water, then yelps as a fish leaps for it. You pause. Fish farming. Oh yes. In select areas, the Aztecs practiced aquaculture. Raising fish like chorales and acasiles, tiny crustaceans used in soups and sauces. Some fringe theories suggest that specific canal sections were designated for fish nurseries using woven fences to trap them. And get this, some even claim priests oversaw these nurseries to ensure that no fish were harvested without a blessing. Divine seafood management. Honestly, kind of wholesome. The farmer returns this time, scooping water into a jug. It's not for drinking, though you wouldn't want to. It's for irrigation. One of the unsung genius features of chinampas was their capillary system. The raised beds were so porous that lake water seeped up naturally into the roots of crops. No hoses, no pumps. Just gravity and mud and smart geometry. You've now entered a section known among chinamperos as the Aztec. Resting beds. These aren't abandoned. They're fallow, intentionally left to recharge. Covered with cover crops or wild herbs, they draw nitrogen from the air, break up the soil, and welcome back pollinators. You spot a monarch butterfly fluttering across a field of sunflowers, and for a moment time feels blurry. Past, present, dream, it's all dancing together. In the distance, you see a group of elders huddled beneath a shade structure, sipping atole, a warm maize drink, while quietly observing the land. You recognize one from earlier, the seed sorter with the blue maize kernel. They don't speak, but you sense they're guardians. Not owners, not bosses, just people who understand that land is borrowed, not possessed. A small boy arrives holding out a broken wooden paddle. The elder takes it, studies the crack, and gestures toward the ahuejote grove. The lesson: tools from trees, trees from soil, soil from silt. silt from water, water from mountain gods. The system is whole, circular, floating but grounded. And just as you begin to relax into this rhythm, lulled by the whisper of willows and the occasional duck honk, a dragonfly lands on your hand. Its wings catch the fading light like glass. You lock eyes, and it seems to whisper, "We've always been here." Then it's gone, and you're left wondering, was this just good farming or something closer to a pact? Night descends like a velvet curtain, and the last threads of sunlight melt behind the trees. The water takes on a new mood, less sparkle, more shadow. As you drift deeper into the Chinampa world under moonlight, the landscape becomes quieter but never truly still. Crickets strike up their shaky orchestra, frogs begin their bass solos, and somewhere in the reeds something splashes once, then goes still. This is when the guardians of the night Sechetin emerge, though not all of them are human. You see a flicker of flame in the distance, then another. Little lanterns bobbing along the banks, casting soft light on canoes tethered to dock poles. These are the night shifts, the workers who tend to the Chinampas in cooler hours. Some are old insomniacs with sore knees. Others are younger, sent to scare off raccoons, and on rare occasions, water spirits. Yes, water spirits. If you thought the Aztecs didn't mix farming with mythology, think again. The canals, especially under cover of darkness, were thought to belong to unseen forces. Ahuizotl. For example, a creature said to lurk beneath the surface, waiting to yank the careless into the deep. Described as a dog-like being with a hand on its tail, because of course it had a hand on its tail, it was believed to drown humans not at random, but for cosmic reasons. As in, you probably offended a deity by forgetting your offering reasons. You might chuckle, but even today some locals avoid certain canals after dusk. That tells you something about how powerful and persistent these stories are. A canoe glides past you, now paddled by a young man with a torch tied to the prow. He hums softly, watching the shadows, not just for animals, but for signs. In Aztec agricultural culture, omens mattered. A certain bird call, a strange wind pattern, or the way ash settled on the fields, these weren't just coincidences. They were read like nature's scripture. Scholars still debate whether these interpretations came from priestly classes or whether farmers themselves developed localized rituals. There's evidence both ways depending on which codices you squint at the hardest. You float past a Chinampa where someone has left an offering, 3 marigolds, a strip of white cloth, and a bundle of tamales. This isn't lunch. It's for Tlaloc, the rain god. Maybe the family's asking for gentle weather. Or maybe they're thanking him for not drowning their bean patch last week. Either way, it's a whisper into the divine darkness. There's a moment where your boat slips under an arching tree branch, and the whole world seems to invert. Sky below, earth above. For just a heartbeat, it's as if you're paddling through some upside-down dreamscape. And then plop, a turtle slides off a log, reminding you gravity still works here. Now let's peek into the spiritual side of farming. Every stage of the Chinampa cycle had meaning. Preparing soil that was about welcoming fertility. Planting seeds, a sacred trust. Harvesting, a debt paid. Some farmers would offer maize to their tools before starting the season, brushing them with smoke or water, whispering thanks. Call it superstition, or call it what it really was. Respect for the cycle. And don't forget the Chamilpa calendar, a system of planting and rotating crops that matched both the seasons and religious festivals. For example, corn wasn't just planted when the ground felt warm, It was aligned with days dedicated to agricultural deities like Chicomacoatl, the maize goddess. Her image shows up in carvings holding 7 ears of corn, each said to represent a kind of abundance food health family. And yes, even good gossip. Speaking of gossip, here's a quirky tidbit. In some Chinampa communities, it was believed that speaking too proudly about your crops could jinx some cakes and to them. So if your tomatoes were looking amazing, you had to complain they were shriveling. Terrible season, you'd say, while secretly harvesting a bumper crop. Reverse bragging, a tradition as old as time. You pass a plot, now bathed in moonlight, its rows perfectly straight, maize tassels swaying slightly in the breeze. The farmer who tends it, gone to sleep by now, probably has left little tokens at the corners, feathers, shells, and a twist of cotton string. Protective charms, nothing big, just a nudge to the spirits. Hey, we're cool, right? Historians argue whether these small folk practices ever made it into state religion. Some say yes, the empire absorbed local traditions like a sponge. Others insist that high priests and Chinampa farmers operated in parallel spiritual lanes. Like two different bands sharing a stage but playing their own songs. You feel it now, the duality. Farming as survival, yes, but also farming as ceremony. Each cornstalk standing like a prayer. Each seed pressed into the soil like a secret only the earth can read. There's a light drizzle now, just enough to speckle the canal surface and make the night air smell of wet leaves and stone. You duck your head under a low archway and find yourself in a narrow canal between high-growing crops. It's quiet here. Sacred quiet. On one Chinampa, a small structure glows faintly. Inside, a man chants something rhythmic while grinding seeds. Could be amaranth. Could be cacao. Could be part of a midnight offering. You listen from the shadows, the sound of stone on stone like the heartbeat of the land. Just then, a fish leaps from the canal, arcs through the air, and splashes down again. No big moment. Just nature being loud. But something about it feels symbolic. Like the land saying, yes, I'm awake too. And there off to your left, you catch a glimpse of something old and carved. A stone head half buried in the bank. Time-worn features, eyes closed, lips parted in an almost smile. Maybe it's a deity. Maybe it's just a rock with attitude. Either way, it watches you pass. You float on the sound of paddles behind you, growing more distant. And though you're technically alone, you don't feel alone. Because the Chinampas at night are never empty. They're full of memories, songs, ghosts, old gods with soft footsteps. And maybe, just maybe, they've been watching over this place the whole time, torchlight or no torchlight. Your boat drifts on, guided now less by will than by water itself. The air is rich with night blossoms and damp earth, and there's a softness to it all, like the land has exhaled, and everything is suspended in its gentle breath. The stars above are sharp, crisp points on an inky canvas. No city haze, no buzzing neon, just the real sky, the kind that farmers once used to read the future. Tonight it's your turn to read it, or at least pretend you can. You look up and spot Soaino, Orion Hautzer. To the east, his belt tilted just so. For the Aztecs, constellations weren't idle wallpaper. They were living indicators. Orion's rise could signal a shift in agricultural season. The Pleiades cluster a sign of new beginnings. The sun's position at equinox or solstice was a literal reset button, ceremonies, sowing, and sacrifices all tied to celestial alignments. But the Aztecs didn't just look up. They mapped the heavens into their everyday choices. Crops were chosen, harvest days, decided, even water levels predicted based on sky movements. And not always accurately, because let's face it, Weather's still just nature's dice roll, but it was a calculated roll. Historians still argue whether Chinampa farmers used their own star charts, or if they relied on centralized priestly calendars. Some claim every household had its own way of marking time: clay discs, carved sticks, etched bone tools. Others say the empire tightly controlled that knowledge. It's one of those debates that'll probably never settle unless someone finds a celestial GPS system buried under Lake Xochimilco. You smile at that thought, then glance down and realize your reflection is gone. No, not in a horror movie way. The water's just churned with movement now. You're near a Chinampa where they're harvesting. 3 workers in loose white tunics stand ankle-deep in dark soil, pulling up bunches of calabaza chacomas, squash fat, and gleaming in the moonlight. Beside them, a dog sleeps with one eye, half-open tail, twitching whenever a root resists the tug. The harvest here isn't done with machinery. It's hands and spades and laughter between friends. The produce is bundled in woven baskets, teenates, stacked high at the canal edge, ready to be floated to market come dawn. The harvest ritual might seem low-tech, but don't be fooled, it's precise. Each crop is interplanted for a reason. Maize offers shade for beans. Beans enrich the soil with nitrogen. Squash sprawls low, its broad leaves keeping moisture in and weeds out. This trio, maize, beans, and squash, is the Mesoamerican holy trinity of farming, sometimes called the Three Sisters. You can't help but admire how unproblematic their relationship is. Not like your group project partners. In one corner of the Chinampa, a small area is left untouched. Not by accident. It's called the Tierra de Descanso, the resting ground. Here, medicinal herbs grow: wild epizote, wormseed mint, maybe even a hallucinogenic fungus or two. You hear one of the harvesters mention dream tea in passing. That's not metaphorical. Certain herbs were brewed into nighttime concoctions to promote vivid, even prophetic dreams. Whether those dreams were useful or just cosmic entertainment is interpretive. The workers begin singing now softly, a rhythmic chant you don't recognize, but that loops like a lullaby. It's hypnotic. You lean back in your boat and let the sound carry you. And as your eyelids flutter, don't worry. I'll nudge you if something weird crawls in. You start to see the harvest not just as a job, but as a spiritual exchange. They're not taking from the land. They're completing a deal. Earlier in the season, seeds were tucked into soil with a whisper, maybe a pinch of ash or cornmeal for luck. Now the earth gives back. No drama, no invoice, just fulfillment. Of course, there are times when the land doesn't deliver. Drought, disease, freak hailstorms, none of it was avoidable then any more than it is now. But in those moments, farmers turned to power ritual compensation. Water not arriving. You gave thanks anyway. Even left out food offerings for the canal spirits. It wasn't just about control, it was about humility. Which brings us to one of the more unexpected Aztec customs, farming festivals, that included masked dancers imitating crops. Yes, you heard that right. During certain seasonal celebrations, especially around the harvest, you'd see performances where people dressed as maize or squash spirits reenacting growth, struggle, and abundance. It was agriculture meets theater. Some performances were solemn, others cheeky. There's one description involving someone in a corn mask tripping over their own husks to make the kids laugh. That guy was the MVP. Whether these performances were meant to honor the gods, thank the land, or just shake off a hard season's dust is up for debate. Scholars point to both religious and communal reasons. Either way, they show a truth you can feel tonight. Farming was more than survival. It was celebration. Your boat bumps gently against a reed wall, and you realize you've stopped moving. Ahead, Another canoe is being loaded. Two men carefully stack tomatoes into crates made of split reeds and fiber rope. The tomatoes here are smaller, darker tangier than the ones in your grocery store. You reach out and swipe one bite into it. Acid and sun. That's what it tastes like. The man loading crates smiles, doesn't say a word, just nods. You nod back, silent understanding, and then the dog from earlier trots up and sniffs your boat. You pat its head. It licks your fingers. If this were a video game, you've just made a friend for life. Name it wisely. As the workers tie off their boats and the sky shifts from deep indigo to the palest hint of lavender, you realize something profound has unfolded here tonight. You didn't just watch a harvest. You witnessed a pact between water, soil, stars, sweat, and song. You watched ancient tech hum under the moonlight. You saw a civilization feed itself without conquering the land beneath its feet. And you wonder as your new dog friend curls up in your lap, tail wagging in dreams. What if this was the future, not the past? Your canoe moves again, slow, lazy, like it knows you're not quite ready for dawn. The dog stays curled in your lap, a warm loaf of trust, twitching now and then in whatever heroic dream dogs have when they've sniffed one too many squash blossoms. The sky is bruising into a lighter shade of gray-blue. A low mist has unfurled across the canals like a giant sigh. And now the chinampas start to stir, not with mystery or myth, but with the practical rhythm of morning. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth wraps around you, grounding you in the truth that this floating garden, for all its sacredness, still feeds real mouths every day. Ahead, you spot a family of 4 already out on their plot. A man chops compost with a flint-bladed hoe. A child scampers after chickens. A woman stoops to inspect chili plants, her fingers moving with the practiced grace of someone who knows exactly how much green is too green. You hear the clink of tools, the murmur of casual arguments, who left the gate open, where did the paddle go? And it's all beautifully mundane. And here, under the early sun, comes the science part of this whole thing. The true low-tech genius of chinampa maintenance. Remember those canal borders we passed before, the ones lined with ahuejote trees, tall and leafy like willows with a minor caffeine addiction? Those aren't just decorative. They stabilize the borders, reduce erosion, and create windbreaks that protect fragile crops. Their roots act like rebar in concrete, binding the soil together. You can almost hear the trees flexing like, yeah, we hold up the neighborhood. Now let's talk sediment dredging. The art of scooping up the nutrient-rich muck from canal bottoms and layering it on the chinampas. It's messy, smelly, and absolutely brilliant. This isn't just compost, it's a literal feeding system. For the soil, the Aztecs had figured out a renewable loop long before modern permaculture gave it a fancy name. Historians still debate whether dredging happened seasonally, monthly, or as needed. Some sources say each family had its own schedule passed down with the tomato seeds and curse words. Others argue it was coordinated at the community level, maybe even enforced by canal stewards. Either way, it was essential. The muck was gold, black gold, and not the kind Texas cares about. You drift past one chinampa, where the owners laid out mats of dried algae. These will be mixed into the soil later to boost nitrogen levels. It's all incredibly efficient and oddly poetic, feeding the land with what the water grows. And here's a weird little tidbit: some chinamperos used human hair as fertilizer. Not in creepy quantities, but enough to add phosphorus and a pinch of dark humor to the fields. Trimmed hair from family members was saved, dried, and worked into the earth because even grandma's bangs had a role in the cycle. As the light rises, you notice how clean the system looks. Not sterile, but intentional. Waste is rare. Chickens peck near the compost heap, pigs root around near old maize husks, and everything has its place. Even the canoes, when not floating, are flipped and stored under trellises to provide shade for delicate herbs. You're starting to see how much this isn't just a farm. It's a cog machine made of nature. Equal parts biology and choreography. There's an elderly woman now patting mud into place around a new squash mound. She moves slow but sure, her rhythm matching the pulse of the land. A boy helps her, asking questions, poking at worms, getting elbow-deep in mud without a trace of squeamishness. You hear her explain something in Nahuatl, a soft-spoken lesson about soil temperatures and moon phases. The language itself curls around your ears like a lullaby carved from corn husks. The Aztecs understood microclimates in a way modern meteorologists might envy. They adjusted planting based on shade patterns, wind direction, and proximity to certain trees or water bends. They built raised beds to manage moisture, not just for floods, but to keep roots warm or cool depending on the season. You spot one chinampa shaped like a crescent, not aesthetic, intentional. That curve protects the eastern edge from sharp morning sun, giving lettuce a chance to ease into its photosynthetic responsibilities. Oh, and lest you think pests were a modern problem, meet the Aztec solution. Yes, actual ducks. Released into the canals during certain times of year, they paddled around eating mosquito larvae and soft-bodied pests without harming crops, and their droppings more bonus fertilizer. It's hard not to admire an agricultural system that runs on birds, bacteria, and baked squash. Of course, no system's perfect. Salinization could become an issue if rainfall patterns shifted. So some chinampas were rotated into rest cycles, left fallow, or planted with low-demand crops to give the soil time to recover. The earth got a vacation, more than you probably. You pass by a man spreading crushed obsidian flakes at the edge of his plot. Not for magic, though. Obsidian certainly had spiritual significance, but for deterring rodents. The sharp shards created a prickly border that discouraged digging. It's like ancient barbed wire, but shinier and with way more goth energy. As you drift farther, you realize you've seen no fences, no padlocks. The fields are open, not unprotected, but trusted. Property lines are known by footstep, not signage. Even today, among some modern chinamperos, that sense of unwritten respect still pulses. A quiet agreement. What grows on your island stays on your island unless you trade me for eggs. You smile because that's not just sustainable, that's civil. And maybe the most important thing, you notice something you didn't expect, is how little plastic you've seen. No bottles bobbing, no bags snagged on tree branches. The materials are all compostable, cane fiber, ceramic gourd. Tools that return to the earth when they're done. No fanfare, no branding, just usefulness, then rest. As the morning sharpens and the birdsong ramps up, your little dog friend stretches and yawns, clearly unimpressed by the whole spectacle of human ingenuity. But you're wide awake now, because the more you learn, the clearer it becomes. The Aztecs weren't just feeding themselves, Suksun. They were building a system that listened to the land, to the water, to time. And somewhere in the soft squish of a muddy heel print, the flutter of morning leaves, and the whisper of worms turning the soil, you hear a message not meant to survive, but that somehow did. You can grow your world without breaking it. By now the morning has bloomed into something golden. Sunlight filters through the feathered branches of the ahuejote trees, leaving you striped in warm light and drifting shadow. Your little boat glides between reed walls and flower-draped fences. Your dog companion yawns again, his tongue lolling out like he's exhausted from supervising so much genius farming. You're just soaking it in. Because here's where the floating farms stop being historical fact and start becoming a living legacy. Ahead, you hear something unexpected. Reggaeton. You round the bend and boom, there it is. A modern chinampa, active and alive, run by a small group of urban farmers. Hoodies, cargo pants, a solar panel charging a phone, and rows of lettuce so photogenic they could star in their own reality show. This isn't a reenactment. These are real people, locals from Mexico City trying to revive and reinvent the old ways. You wave. They wave back, one holding up a cup of something iced and probably magical. And this is where things get very now. You see, chinampas never truly disappeared. They shrank, yes. With Spanish colonization came floods, canals turned to roads, floating gardens gave way to pavement and real estate schemes. But in the lake beds of Xochimilco and Yatlahuac, the bones of the ancient system endured. Even today, dozens, possibly hundreds of chinampas still function. Some are still commercially productive, sending crates of greens and herbs to Mexico City's markets. Others serve more modern missions, sustainability experiments, school programs, slow food movements, even Airbnb experiences if you're willing to trade Wi-Fi for frog song. Historians still debate whether these modern chinampas operate with the same engineering standards as the originals. Some purists argue they're simplified imitations lacking the complex water management systems and ritual cycles. Others believe innovation is the whole point, adapting the genius of the past to solve the chaos of the present. You look at a young woman carefully measuring out compost ratios, a man filming a time-lapse of the sunrise over squash leaves, and it's hard not to feel a little hope. They're not playing dress-up. They're building something real, and they're doing it with help from some surprising allies. There's a UNESCO designation, Calcari, hanging over this area now. A nod of respect, sure, but also a lifeline. Efforts are underway to preserve the ecological and cultural landscape of the Xochimilco wetlands. Not just the farms, but the traditions, the languages, the birds, the boats, the water itself, which brings us to a thorny little question. Can you preserve something ancient while still using it? It's a balancing act. On one side, tradition. The old tools. The rituals. The song lines passed through generations like heirloom seeds. On the other, necessity. Climate change, urban sprawl, global food systems that reward monoculture and punish slowness. You can't just cosplay the past and expect the present to wait for you. So here's what's happening. Some chinamperos are blending both worlds, using drip irrigation to conserve water, growing non-native crops, like kale or cherry tomatoes to appeal to restaurants and health food markets. Others are reintroducing native maize varieties, protecting endangered seeds like they're national treasures because honestly, they kind of are. You drift by a field where two farmers are comparing seedling trays, one labeled with Nahuatl terms, the other with QR codes linking to a crop tracker app. You get the feeling this is how revolutions start. Quietly, with spreadsheets and soil under your nails. But not everyone is thrilled. Some locals feel the new wave of chinampa revivalists are romanticizing a way of life they don't truly understand. That they take selfies with crops their ancestors bled for. That they restore fields only to sell gourmet herbs to restaurants that wouldn't survive a single week without DoorDash. It's a fair critique. And yet standing here, or rather floating among chili plants and playlist thumps and dragonflies the size of USB sticks, you sense something deeper. A return not to a specific moment in time, but to a way of thinking. Circular, regenerative, human-scaled. And that's where this whole story might just loop back around. Because the genius of the Chinampa system was never about the rafts or the soil or even the floating. It was the philosophy. A way of seeing land as partner, not possession. Of growing food in tune with rhythm, not just yield. Of feeding people without bankrupting the very systems that support life. That mindset, yeah, it's making a comeback. You float past a group of kids on a school field trip. Their uniforms dusty, their shoes mud-slick, their faces lit up like they just discovered chocolate for the first time. One holds up a wriggling worm with the awe of someone meeting their first wizard. You chuckle. They're not just learning history, they're touching it. Literally. And as they pile back into a bright blue boat, you spot a cooler labeled delivery filled with bundles of herbs, cilantro, epazote, hoja santa, tied with twine and tucked into banana leaves. Destination: a local chef. A few kilometers away in a kitchen with stainless steel counters and white-tiled walls, someone is plating pre-Hispanic ingredients for a crowd that probably won't recognize half the flavors. But the flavor's not the point. The point is that the chain continues, from ancient mud to modern menus, from ritual offerings to rooftop gardens, from priestly calendars to permaculture YouTube channels. It's not a resurrection, it's a remix. And like any good remix, it carries the soul of the original, just set to a new beat. As you glide farther into the wetlands, the dog in your lap sighs like he's heard all this before. Maybe he has. Maybe dogs remember the old world better than we do. And maybe, just maybe, you realize the Chinampa system wasn't lost. It was just waiting for us to grow up enough to listen. Your canoe drifts onward deeper into the watery arteries of this old lake world, and you're starting to notice something different in the way the air moves now. It's less crisp, more hushed, as if the plants and water are conspiring to hold your attention just a little longer. Your dog, whose eyes are now barely slits, shifts his weight slightly, a soft thump against your thigh, and the moment stretches. But this part of the journey, it's not about new tech or Instagrammable veggies. It's about shodo de dikanino. What this floating world taught the world. And why most of us didn't listen. See, the genius of Chinampas didn't go unnoticed. In fact, when the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s dragging armor disease and European farming traditions behind them, they were stunned. Hernán Cortés and his entourage supposedly stared slack-jawed at the vast green grid of floating farms, thinking they'd stumbled into some sort of mythic paradise. The neat rows, the mirrored waters, the floating walkways. It was agriculture, but prettier and smarter. The Spaniards even wrote admiring reports back to Europe, marveling at the hoked incredible yields. These Indians achieved without using plows or beasts of burden. No oxen dragging soil into submission. Just humans, mud, and balance. It was efficient, elegant, and inconveniently better than what they'd brought with them. Historians still argue whether the Spanish seriously attempted to adopt Chinampa methods, or simply admired them from afar before steamrolling over them. Some say small pockets of Chinampa knowledge slipped into colonial farming manuals. Others believe the system was intentionally sidelined to make way for European-style land grants and wheat fields. What we do know, by the 17th century, large swaths of Lake Texcoco had been chachino, drained. Not gently, not responsibly, just obliterated, turned into dry land for expansion and civilization. Because floating gardens too native, too pagan, too wet, and yet the idea of farming on water didn't disappear. It just drifted. Flash forward a few centuries, and you'll find versions of Chinampas often inspired directly or indirectly by the Aztecs, sprouting up around the world. Take Bangladesh. where floating gardens called dap or baira rise during monsoon season, layered with water hyacinth and composted vegetation. They're used to grow okra cucumbers and leafy greens even when floodwaters submerge everything else. It's survival farming with echoes of Tenochtitlan. Or Myanmar's Inle Lake, where locals have built floating beds from silt bamboo and aquatic plants for centuries. Their version of chinampas supports tomatoes and beans tethered in place with bamboo poles like drifting produce aisles. Even modern-day climate researchers and urban planners have taken notes. In the Netherlands, where rising sea levels threaten land security, architects are exploring floating agriculture, not hydroponics, in glass boxes, but systems rooted in sediment and natural cycles. Sound familiar? You start to realize this isn't just about nostalgia, it's about necessity. The Chinampa concept. Resilient, regenerative, hyper-local solves problems we still haven't cracked. It doesn't just produce food, it creates its own inputs. It builds soil, filters water, regulates microclimates. In the face of climate change, soil degradation, and water scarcity. That's not retro, it's revolutionary. And yet, why isn't it everywhere? Well, Chinampas aren't plug-and-play. They require canals, community long-term maintenance, and a relationship with land that most of us haven't had since childhood or ever. You can't just drop one into a concrete city block and expect lettuce by Friday. Plus, modern agriculture runs on speed. Fertilizer tractors, chemicals, automation. Chinampas run on Wenkonja cycles. Time, mud, hands, that kind of slowness. Not super scalable by Wall Street standards, but there's a new wave of thinkers, scientists, activists, slow food chefs who are circling back. Asking what if the future of food isn't vertical farms and synthetic meat, but horizontal relationships? What if the answer isn't new, but remember, you pass a small chinampa now tucked behind a curtain of reeds. It's quiet, humble. Just a few rows of marigolds and maize. You spot an old man crouched at the edge feeding handfuls of dried leaves into the water slowly, reverently, like casting spells. He sees you. He smiles. Just a flicker. Then returns to his work, and you wonder if he's thinking the same thing, that the true inheritance of the Aztecs wasn't the gold or the temples or the pyramids with their staircases designed to destroy your knees. It was this OA system that works because it listens. The Spanish may have razed cities and renamed gods, but the roots of the Chinampa system deeper. Through mud, through memory, through every act of planting that said, we belong here with this water in this season. And like any good story, the Chinampa tale was never just Aztec. It was always human, invented in one place, needed everywhere. You look up. A heron slices through the sky. No hurry, no noise, just flight over a place that's always been both field and mirror. Your dog lifts his head, sniffs the air, smiles his little dog smile. And you think maybe what the Aztecs taught wasn't just how to farm on water. Maybe it was how to bombalonca to a place so fully that even the land forgives your footsteps. The light begins to shift, now slipping toward that amber hour when the water glows, and everything, trees, birds, even your own fingers, looks like it's been dipped in honey. Your canoe rocks gently as the dog settles deeper into your lap, sighing in a way that sounds suspiciously like, finally. And this is the part of the story where we admit something. Even though the Chinampa system feels ancient, poetic, maybe even otherworldly, it was never perfect. It wasn't magic. It had flaws, quirks, and unexpected downsides just like any complex human invention. Let's talk about those. For starters, while Chinampas were brilliant at producing food in wetland zones, they were labor-intensive. Like goodbye free time, hello soil hauling levels of effort. Maintaining canals, hauling mud, planting in tight rotations, controlling pests without chemical shortcuts. This wasn't weekend gardening with your Spotify playlist on. This was daily grind, sun up to sundown. And because it was so hands-on, it required tight-knit communities and constant cooperation. If your neighbor didn't clear their canal, your water flow suffered. If one person dumped something nasty into the system, say goat droppings, or that mysterious, unlabeled jar from grandma's shelf, it didn't just affect them. It affected everyone. Kind of like that one guy in the office microwave who always reheats fish. Yeah, exactly like that. Also, Chinampas were somewhat vulnerable to unnatural disasters. Heavy rains could flood them. Prolonged droughts could dry up the canal grid, and earthquakes, of which central Mexico has plenty, could disrupt the delicate layering of soil and vegetation. Not ideal when your farm is basically a sponge floating on a former lake. Then there were the pests. Without industrial pesticides, farmers had to rely on clever natural methods, like using frogs and birds to eat insects, or planting aromatic herbs to deter invaders, which worked most of the time. But if things got out of balance, say hello to Aphid-palooza. And even socially, the system wasn't some utopia of barefoot harmony. Chinampa land was a hot commodity. Its high fertility and dependable productivity meant that nobles and wealthy families often scooped up the best parcels. Some Chinamperos owned their land, yes, but others leased it, worked it for tribute, or got pushed off it entirely during different phases of political upheaval. Historians still argue whether land tenure in the Chinampa regions was more egalitarian than elsewhere in the empire, or just as stratified with a prettier aesthetic. Some documents suggest a kind of local autonomy. Others hint at heavy taxation and oversight from imperial bureaucrats who probably never touched mud in their lives. And yet, despite all that, the system lasted. For centuries. Through shifting climates, regime changes, even Spanish conquest, that kind of resilience doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being adaptable. From letting mistakes compost into wisdom, which brings us to something surprisingly beautiful. How knowledge passed down. Chinampa wisdom wasn't kept in thick books or locked in scrolls. It was mostly oral, taught by doing, shown in gestures and seasons and timing, passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, like a recipe that starts with, "Watch me not read this." You can still see that today. A young farmer steering his canoe with his knee while tying up a floating compost sack with both hands. A grandmother squatting barefoot on the Chinampa edge, tossing pulverized eggshells into the soil while muttering what might be a prayer or a recipe or both. A teenager with headphones on pulling water weeds and nodding to the beat of some track you can't hear but fully approve of. That's the real magic. Not that the system worked, but that it was understood. Deeply, holistically. Not just in how it functioned, but in how it fit into the lives, diets, rituals, and identities of the people who used it. And yet you can't help but think about how easily it could have been lost. For a while it almost was. In the 20th century, massive parts of the Chinampa zone were destroyed. Urban expansion, pollution, canalization, and negligence all took their toll. Sewage from the growing city was dumped into the wetlands. Roads were built where canals once ran. Tourists came snapping selfies among marigolds without understanding what they were walking on or what had been sacrificed to keep it growing. Even today, many Chinampas are abandoned, overgrown, choked by invasive plants or dried out by mismanaged water systems. It's sobering, like seeing the skeleton of something once divine. But every so often you'll stumble across a restoration project, a pocket of stubbornness, a person or community saying, no, this matters. You pass one now, a small team, 3 generations of the same family, rebuilding the edges of a chinampa, with logs reeds in their bare hands. The youngest, maybe 12, is laughing as he gets splashed with canal water. The oldest, probably 75, nods approvingly, but says nothing. This isn't ceremony. It's continuation. And here's the kicker, no one told them to do it. No one paid them. They're not waiting for a grant or an influencer campaign. They're just doing what's been done before. Because it works. Because it matters. Because in a world that forgets so quickly, remembering is a radical act. Your dog shifts again, and you realize you've been still for a while. Not out of fatigue, but reverence. You're watching history not in a museum or textbook, but unfolding in front of you with muddy boots and tired smiles. It's enough to make you want to build one yourself. Though let's be real, your HOA would absolutely lose its mind. But maybe that's the lesson. You don't need a lake. You don't need Aztec ancestry. You just need curiosity, patience, and a willingness to try again even when the world says no. Because this system, flawed and beautiful and muddy and alive, isn't just something the Aztecs made. It's something they entrusted to us, to us. Your canoe eases into stiller water, now slower, deeper, almost motionless. You barely notice it at first. The paddle just glides easier. The dog's tail no longer thumps, but curls beside him like a question mark finally answered. The air feels heavier, full of twilight, and this last stretch isn't about farming anymore. It's about legacy. Not the kind carved into monuments or etched into coins. No, the legacy of chinampas is softer, slower. The kind that clings to hands and memories. The kind whispered from elders to kids with dirt under their nails. And weirdly enough, it's still malcam, whispering. Despite centuries of decay, there are people today, yes right now, who are not just preserving chinampas, but freeing them. Reviving the concerto. Them. You float past a young man, standing knee-deep in water, adjusting the wooden posts that frame a new canal. He hums to himself, something tuneless but content. Beside him, 2 volunteers from the city, one with glitter on her cheeks, the other wearing socks with tacos on them, scoop compost from woven baskets onto the fresh soil mound. They're not reenactors. This isn't cosplay. This is real Tikaks farming, real learning, real stewardship. Across the world, green movements are catching on. Permaculture nerds, regenerative ag folks, climate activists, they're looking at chinampas and asking, how did we miss this? And the answer, frustratingly enough, is we didn't. We just forgot. Forgot that food doesn't have to come from bulldozed fields or sterile warehouses. Forgot that water isn't the enemy of soil, it's its dance partner. Forgot that the most efficient systems are often the ones that mimic nature, not override it. And here's where things get poetic. Remember all those scientists warning about sea level rise, about increased flooding, soil loss, crop failure. Turns out the very things that made modern agriculture so brittle, monocultures, over-tilling dependence on fossil fuels, are exactly what chinampas never relied on. While the rest of us built farming around domination, the chinamperos built around harmony. Historians still argue whether chinampas count as aquaculture or agriculture, as if the distinction really matters. Maybe that's the problem, our need to sort label control. Chinampas don't care. They just work in water, with roots and rhythms and worms and ducks. In fact, the ducks are a whole thing. Some Chinampa farmers today reintroduce ducks not just for eggs and meat, but for pest control. The ducks waddle through the crops, gobbling up insects while leaving plants mostly untouched. It's adorable and practical and deeply, delightfully Aztec. But let's zoom out one more time before we settle in. The Chinampa system wasn't just farming genius. It was Malkam, worldview. A belief that life, plant, animal, human intertwines. That water gives, soil remembers, and food is both sustenance and offering. A worldview where the land is a relative, not a resource. And while the temples and calendars get all the headlines, maybe this quiet, floating network of mud and maize was the Aztecs' truest monument. Not stone, but soil. Not conquest, but cultivation. There's a calm now that spreads across your chest like warm cloth. The day is nearly gone. The stories are nearly told. But the water, still reflecting the last orange glimmers of sky, keeps whispering. You close your eyes for a moment. You imagine what it was like back then, the chant of frogs, the rattle of corn stalks, the creak of paddle against water. A man with a painted face tending tomatoes. A woman weaving baskets from reeds. A child giggling as a turtle slips off a log. No one thinking they're part of something historic. Just living. Just being. Just feeding the cycle. And now that cycle is yours too. Because here's the last secret: you don't need a Chinampa to carry its lessons. You just need to listen. To your land, wherever it is. To your food, however it grows. To your own rhythm, however messy. The Chinampa system isn't a blueprint. It's a conversation. Between earth and water. Between ancestors and future selves. Between you and this moment. The canoe finally bumps a soft bank. The dog lifts his head but doesn't move. You've arrived. No grand finale, no fireworks, just this. A floating farm. A world remembered. A story passed forward one whisper at a time. Now slow it all down. Let your breath match the rhythm of this gentle water. In and out. Feel the heaviness in your limbs like soil settling into the bottom of a still canal. No more paddling. No more talking. Just the hush of twilight and the comfort of old remembered things. You're surrounded by quiet now, the kind that hums like memory. A few birds shift in the distance. Crickets tune their legs. Somewhere far off, a reed boat creaks on its tether. It's not silence exactly. It's peace. The kind the world forgets it can have. Let your thoughts float like water lilies, light, effortless, unattached. Maybe you're drifting across a Chinampa. Maybe you're planting seeds with ancient hands. Or maybe you're just here in bed listening. That's enough. That's everything. Because the lessons tonight weren't about farming, not really. They were about connection, slowness, listening. The way things can thrive when left in harmony with what surrounds them. So if your body feels heavier now, that's perfect. If your mind feels lighter, that's the point. You've wandered through water and time, through mud and memory. You've seen the world that floats and feeds. Now there's nothing left to do. Just breathe. Just rest. The Chinampas will still be there in the morning, and so will the story. End of script. Sweet dreams.